I find myself often thinking back to a meeting I had a few years ago where there were a number of colleagues corresponding about a project they all worked on together. And two of these colleagues were trying to give each other feedback. There was a kind of shift in the energy, then the meeting ended and they went their separate ways. And when I caught up with one of my colleagues later, he had said he felt his other colleague's feedback had been unnecessarily critical. She'd been really blunt and she hadn't helped to move the project forward in the optimistic way he'd been hoping for. When I caught up with my other colleague, she said she found his feedback very vague, imprecise, and it was really unclear what he wanted her to do in that instance. And when I've reflected back on that meeting, it's very clear that that energy didn't shift because anybody was communicating poorly. They were both very strong communicators. But they obviously had different expectations of what that meeting was intended for, what they were going to get out of it, and combined with their personal communication styles, it's impossible not to interpret somebody else's communication through that lens you've got of both expectation and personal communication style. Hi, I'm Kerry from Neurodiversify, and I help workplaces everywhere unpack why miscommunications and misunderstandings still happen, even when everyone is really trying their best and they think they're communicating effectively. More often than not, this involves me talking about something called the double empathy problem. For a long time, research around communication and neurodivergence situated the problem disproportionately with neurodivergent people. If there's a conversation, for example, between an autistic person and a non-autistic person, and that conversation is stilted or the conversation and communication breaks down, then more often than not, the fault seems to lie with the neurodivergent person. Oh, there must be something about the way that they're communicating that means this conversation has broken down. Combined with this, for a long time, research assumed that autistic people had a really tough time understanding what was going on inside the heads of non-autistic people, which we now know to be false, of course. But luckily, in 2012, sociologist Damian Milton proposed something called the double empathy problem. Instead of this kind of one-sided deficit approach where neurodivergent people disproportionately carry the weight of conversation and conversation breakdowns, he proposed something far more mutual, that if conversation breaks down, it's a mutual responsibility, it's a mutual gap in understanding. He conducted some research where autistic people spoke to autistic people, non-autistic people spoke to non-autistic people, and autistic people spoke to non-autistic people, so a cross-neurotype conversation. And what he found is that when people shared a neurotype, so that means autistic to autistic or non-autistic to non-autistic, broadly, conversation flowed really well and was fluid. The breakdown occurred in these cross-neurotype conversations, so when somebody non-autistic and somebody autistic were interacting. What Milton found was that when people share very similar ways of interpreting the world and processing information, conversation, understandably, flowed very well. It's like they understood each other's cues, expectations, and kind of conversational rhythms. But understandably, again, if two people come from very different experiential worlds, that conversation doesn't necessarily flow as easily. And therein lies the double empathy problem. So this gap that sits between people that neither person is wholly responsible for, where this misunderstanding occurs. And importantly, this sets to correct a myth and misinformation that has existed for decades. Empathy was very much not absent, but this research set to explore how does empathy develop, and is it more difficult for empathy to develop across conversations when people have very, very different experiences of the world and different communication styles? And if you think about it, this of course is not limited to just autism or autistic to non-autistic conversations. This is something people bring to many, many different aspects of life. Consider cultural backgrounds, different professional backgrounds, different generations even, experience these miscommunications or misunderstandings. But this research was significant for autistic communities, I guess because autistic people in autistic communities had that much more to lose in somebody assuming that there was no empathy. And this research set to correct that myth that the deficit or the failure in communication somehow sat with the autistic person and shifted it towards something much more mutual and something much more symmetrical. Because we know as well that very often non-autistic people will struggle to interpret the emotional signals or communication styles of autistic people. So why would it ever make sense to situate that issue solely with the autistic person anyway? And as was found in this research, and I think that many of us know almost instinctually, that When neurotypes or experiences of the world are similar, conversation flows really well. So autistic to autistic communication often establishes a very quick rapport and builds very, very quickly. And for me, what I love is it reframes this communication style as there's not one way of communicating which is somehow worse or less than the other. It's more a case of translating across people's experiences, which, as we said, is something that has such widespread application far beyond just autism. So if misunderstandings are mutual, it's not just the responsibility of one set of people or one person to correct that. It becomes this shared challenge that we face all together about how we can communicate more effectively amongst each other. And that is something we'll explore in the next video. So I'll see you there.